Snowdrifts buried cars up to their roofs. Ice storms paralyzed the city for days. The 1960s brought New York some of the most brutal winters in recorded history, transforming the bustling metropolis into a frozen landscape that tested every resident's resilience and reshaped how an entire generation remembered the coldest season. Winter arrived with unprecedented fury in 1960, catching New Yorkers completely unprepared for what would become a defining decade of harsh cold. The December storm of 1960 dumped nearly 15 inches of snow on the city in just 24 hours, stranding commuters in subway stations and turning Fifth Avenue into an impassable white desert. Taxi drivers abandoned their yellow cabs in the middle of intersections, and office workers huddled in building lobbies, watching through frosted windows as the familiar cityscape disappeared beneath relentless snowfall. The temperature plummeted to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind whipped through the concrete canyons of Manhattan with a violence that made simply walking outside feel like a battle against nature itself. Children pressed their faces against apartment windows, watching as their parents struggled home through waist-deep snow, carrying grocery bags like precious cargo. The storm marked the beginning of what meteorologists would later call an anomalous cold pattern. But for everyday New Yorkers, it simply meant survival had suddenly become more difficult. Corner delis ran out of bread and milk within hours, and the few intrepid souls who ventured outside wrapped scarves around their faces until only their eyes remained visible. Moving through the white chaos like Arctic explorers navigating unknown territory in the heart of their own neighborhoods. What caused the storm? 1962 shattered temperature records that had stood for nearly a century, plunging the city into a deep freeze that seemed to have no end. On February 9th, the mercury dropped to -2 degrees Fahrenheit in Central Park, the coldest reading since 1885, and the entire metropolitan area felt as though it had been transported to the Arctic Circle. The East River and Hudson River developed thick ice formations along their edges, something older residents claimed they had never witnessed in their lifetimes, and the Statue of Liberty stood sentinel over a harbor dotted with ice floes that glistened like scattered diamonds under the pale winter sun. Heating systems throughout the city struggled under the unprecedented demand, and apartment radiators clanked and hissed day and night, barely keeping interiors warm enough for comfort. Families draped blankets over windows to keep the cold from seeping through single-pane glass, and elderly residents in tenement buildings wore their overcoats indoors, huddling around kitchen stoves for additional warmth. The cold penetrated everything, freezing water pipes in buildings across all 5 boroughs and creating a plumbing crisis that left thousands without running water for days, forcing them to melt snow in pots just to have enough liquid for cooking and washing. Manhattan's iconic streets became unrecognizable under layers of compacted snow and ice that persisted for months rather than days. Broadway, typically bustling with theatergoers and shoppers, turned into a treacherous obstacle course where pedestrians picked their way carefully between towering mounds of plowed snow that reached second-story windows. Street vendors who normally sold hot pretzels and roasted chestnuts found business booming as frozen commuters desperately sought any source of warmth, and the steam rising from subway grates became gathering spots where people paused to thaw their numbed fingers before continuing their journeys through the frigid landscape. The sanitation department deployed every available truck and worker, but the snowfall outpaced their ability to clear it, creating narrow pathways through what had been wide avenues just days before. Delivery trucks got stuck in intersections, blocking traffic for hours, while drivers and passers-by worked together to push the vehicles free, their breath forming thick clouds in the frozen air. Storefront awnings collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, and icicles hung from fire escapes like prison bars, some growing so long and thick they had to be knocked down with broom handles before they became dangerous spears, threatening anyone walking below on the increasingly hazardous sidewalks. January 1966 brought the storm that would define the decade, a blizzard so massive it brought the entire city to a complete standstill for 3 full days. 27 inches of snow fell on New York City between January 29th and February 1st, accompanied by winds that reached 50 miles per hour, creating whiteout conditions that made it impossible to see more than a few feet in any direction. Mayor John Lindsay, newly inaugurated just weeks earlier, found himself managing a crisis that would come to define his first term, as the city's inadequate snow removal resources were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer volume of white powder that continued falling relentlessly from the dark winter sky. Buses sat abandoned on major thoroughfares, their passengers evacuated and taken to emergency shelters set up in schools and community centers throughout the boroughs. The Long Island Railroad suspended all service, stranding thousands of commuters in Penn Station, where Red Cross volunteers distributed coffee and sandwiches to the impromptu community that formed in the Grand Terminal. Department stores like Macy's and Gimbel's closed their doors for the first time in decades, and the only sounds echoing through the normally cacophonous city were the howling wind and the occasional rumble of a snowplow attempting to forge paths through the mounting drifts that had transformed New York into a silent, frozen ghost town. The relentless cold forced New Yorkers to rediscover ways of living their grandparents had known, stripping away modern conveniences and revealing a more fundamental existence. Grocery deliveries became impossible, so families stockpiled canned goods and learned to make meals stretch further when fresh supplies ran low. Laundromats overflowed with people whose basement washing machines had frozen solid, and clotheslines appeared in kitchens and bathrooms as residents adapted to indoor drying in cramped apartments where space was already at a premium, creating a humid fog that coated windows with frost on the inside as well as the outside. Public transportation operated on severely reduced schedules, and those who absolutely had to get to work bundled in so many layers they could barely move, looking like fabric-wrapped mummies shuffling through the snow. Telephone lines went down during ice storms, cutting off communication between neighbors and family members who might live only blocks apart, and people checked on elderly residents by physically knocking on doors, a practice that had fallen out of favor in the increasingly anonymous urban environment, but now became necessary again. Children stayed home from school for weeks at a time, and mothers organized informal learning groups in apartment buildings, teaching reading and arithmetic to clusters of restless youngsters who pressed their noses against windows, watching the endless snow fall outside. Hypothermia and cold-related illnesses claimed dozens of lives each winter, with the elderly and homeless populations suffering most severely from exposure. Emergency rooms filled with patients presenting with frostbite so severe that fingers and toes had turned black, requiring amputations that would mark survivors for life, with permanent reminders of the brutal seasons they had endured. Hospitals ran low on blood supplies as donors couldn't safely travel to give, and ambulances struggled to reach people in medical distress, sometimes taking hours to cover distances that normally required only minutes, their sirens wailing futilely through streets blocked by mountains of accumulated snow and abandoned vehicles. The homeless population faced a daily battle for survival, seeking refuge in subway stations, public libraries, and the steam tunnels beneath the city streets. Churches and synagogues opened their doors as emergency shelters, their pews filled each night with people wrapped in donated blankets, grateful for any escape from the lethal cold outside. Social services agencies, already stretched thin by the demands of urban poverty, found themselves completely overwhelmed by the additional crisis of keeping vulnerable populations alive through winter months that seemed to extend far beyond their normal duration, creating a humanitarian emergency that exposed deep inequalities in who had access to warmth and safety. Snow days became so frequent that the Board of Education seriously considered extending the school year into July to make up for lost instructional time. Students experienced winters unlike anything their teachers had known, with some schools closed for 2 or 3 consecutive weeks when heating systems failed or buildings became inaccessible due to snow accumulation. When classes did resume, children arrived bundled in hand-me-down coats held together with safety pins, their mittens often soaked through before they even reached the schoolyard, and teachers spent the first hour of each day helping students dry off near radiators before attempting any lessons. Playgrounds turned into dangerous ice rinks, where equipment disappeared beneath frozen mounds, and recess moved indoors to gymnasiums, where children ran laps to burn off energy they couldn't expend outside. Parents organized walking groups to escort children through the treacherous streets, holding hands in chains so no one would slip and fall on the icy sidewalks that the city couldn't keep clear. School cafeterias served hot soup and cocoa more frequently than usual, recognizing that for some students, these might be the only warm meals they received all day, and teachers quietly noticed which children came to school without proper winter clothing, discreetly collecting donations from colleagues to ensure every student had adequate protection against the bitter cold. Broadway theaters operated at half capacity or closed entirely when audiences couldn't reach Midtown, and performers found themselves playing to sparse crowds in cavernous venues designed for hundreds. The Metropolitan Opera canceled performances for the first time in its 80-year history, refunding tickets to disappointed patrons who had been looking forward to productions they might never see again. Jazz clubs in Greenwich Village that normally throbbed with late-night energy sat empty except for the most dedicated musicians and fans, who huddled close to the stage for warmth, their appreciation for the music deepened by the shared hardship of having braved the elements to be there at all. Museums saw attendance drop dramatically, their echoing galleries walked by only the hardiest art lovers, and cultural institutions that depended on steady visitor numbers found themselves facing financial crises. Carnegie Hall, the Guggenheim, and Lincoln Center all reported significant losses, forcing administrators to make difficult decisions about programming and staffing. Television became the dominant form of entertainment by default, with families gathered around their sets watching Ed Sullivan or the evening news, unable to venture out for the social activities that had previously filled their winters, inadvertently accelerating a shift toward home-based entertainment that would characterize the coming decades. Businesses throughout the city hemorrhaged money during extended closures, with small retailers hit particularly hard by the inability to maintain normal operations. Corner stores in working-class neighborhoods operated on such thin profit margins that even a week without customers could mean bankruptcy, and going out of business signs appeared in windows throughout the 5 boroughs as family-owned establishments that had survived the Depression finally succumbed to the accumulated losses of multiple brutal winters. Construction projects ground to a halt when frozen ground made excavation impossible, and workers couldn't safely operate equipment in sub-zero temperatures, delaying building plans and putting thousands of laborers out of work during months when they most needed steady paychecks to afford heating bills. The garment district, typically humming with activity as factories produced clothing for retailers nationwide, slowed to a crawl when workers couldn't reach their machines and delivery trucks couldn't navigate the streets. Dock workers at the Port of New York faced dangerous conditions as ice formed on ship decks and cargo holds, making the already hazardous work even more perilous, and the flow of goods through the nation's busiest harbor slowed to a trickle. Tourism, an increasingly important part of the city's economy, virtually disappeared as visitors canceled hotel reservations and stayed away from a metropolis that had temporarily lost its appeal, creating cascading effects through restaurants, shops, and attractions that depended on out-of-town guests. Meteorologists struggled to explain the unprecedented pattern to a public demanding answers about when the extreme weather would finally end. The National Weather Service analyzed data showing that atmospheric pressure systems had shifted in unusual ways, creating a blocking pattern that trapped Arctic air over the northeastern United States for prolonged periods. But these technical explanations offered little comfort to people simply trying to survive day to day in conditions that felt almost biblical in their severity and relentlessness. Scientists at Columbia University and other research institutions began studying the phenomenon more systematically, collecting data that would later contribute to early climate science. They measured snow depths, tracked temperature fluctuations, and documented wind patterns with an intensity that previous generations of researchers had never applied to winter weather, recognizing that they were witnessing something historically significant that deserved serious scientific attention. The extreme winters of the 1960s helped establish weather observation networks and analytical methods that would become standard practice in meteorology. Though at the time, the researchers simply wanted to understand why nature had turned so harsh against the city they called home. The winters of the 1960s left scars on New York that an entire generation would never forget. Those who survived the frozen decade carried forward stories of resilience that shaped the city forever. Subscribe for more untold history.